Greetings my friends. The huge US military budget, from the point of view of its clear benefits, turns out to be quite comparable with the many times lower defense expenditures of Russia. About a month ago, the US administration published its draft budget for the next fiscal year, which allocates $753 billion to national security programs, including $715 billion for the United States Department of Defense. Without going into details that are of little interest to the general public, we can state that the budget of the American military department has remained practically unchanged for several years, and has been dancing around the figure of $700 billion. At first glance, this is just excessive amounts of money. Actually, that's not strictly true. Let's consider just one specific example, which explains a lot. The estimated cost of the first prototype of the promising American nuclear submarine Columbia, which is to replace the Ohio-class submarine, will amount to approximately $6.2 billion. The construction price of subsequent boats is planned to be reduced to $4.9 billion. However, in reality, the practice of American naval construction is characterized by a strictly opposite trend, an increase in the cost of ships in the process of their development and mass production. A classic example was the story of the destroyers Umvolt, the cost of which increased in the course of events from $1.4 to $7 billion per unit. And the number in the series was reduced from 32 units to 3. Thus, it is already becoming clear that by 2031, when the first nuclear submarine Columbia will be handed over to the Navy, its value will reach at least $10 billion. And now, for comparison, let me tell you that the estimated cost of a similar Russian nuclear submarine of Project 955 Borzz is about $700 million. That is, 10 times cheaper than a Columbia-class submarine. Note that these submarines are roughly the same class with similar weapons and combat capabilities. In other words, in Russia, for the same money that the United States will spend on one submarine, they can build 10 similar ones. Not to mention the fact that the newest Borzz-class submarines are already in the Russian Navy, and the Columbia-class submarines will enter service with the American Navy, at best in 10 years. And, judging by what is happening now in the Pentagon, it is not a fact that these submarines will actually go into service with the US Navy. Nevertheless, even this example is very revealing. First of all, because it clearly reflects the general trend, and gives an idea of how things are in the United States Department of Defense. And secondly, a submarine is not a stone axe of salvage, but a very complex engineering and technical structure. It consists of hundreds of elements and mechanisms, tens of thousands of parts, which are supplied by many enterprises of the military-industrial complex, where a lot of employees work with a corresponding considerable salary. That is, we see a completely typical for the United States a high level of costs per unit of the final product. And therefore, the Columbia Submarine Index can be safely extended to all U.S. military forces. And it turns out that the nominally huge American military budget loses weight by about 10 times, from $700 to $70 billion, and becomes almost equal to the Russian. But that's not all of the problems facing America's military might. The United States Department of Defense, without exaggeration, is literally suffocating under the burden of its global obligations, which require constant and colossal funding. Hundreds of military bases around the world, which every day need to be supplied with everything they need, from missiles and fuel, to the same Big Macs, as well as very big cash payments to personnel and a large number of civilian personnel. Modern Russia practically doesn't have such a global burden as the United States. Except for Syria, which, in fact, very much saves Russia money on combat training of troops, and testing new types of weapons in conditions of real war. Today, there is a lot of talks that the United States is withdrawing its troops from Afghanistan, and has similar plans about Iraq and several other countries. Even exotic versions have appeared, the authors of which see in this some kind of cunning American plan, according to which the withdrawn troops will be transferred closer to the Russian borders, and deployed there in the order of its strategic encirclement. But in fact, with the American cunning plans, everything is much simpler. And everything much sadder for the United States Department of Defense. The fact is that the modern USA simply doesn't have the means to maintain its former global presence. And the printing press is not useful here, because money is getting cheaper regardless of good wishes, but in strict accordance with the real economic possibilities of the country. And these possibilities are not unlimited. But gigantic spending on its world colony is far from the only unbearable burden on America's military budget. The Pentagon is literally tied hand and foot by the need to bear the costs of maintaining the already achieved level of combat power. In particular, all the military equipment that accumulated over decades of global domination. And which, moreover, in its significant part is morally and physically outdated. For example, the same aircraft carriers. And this, nothing less than the foundation of the U.S. Naval Forces. The U.S. Air Force Command has just announced plans for deep cuts in the available arsenal. The U.S. Air Force will ask the U.S. Congress to decommission 421 obsolete combat aircraft by 2026, replacing them with 304 new fighters. Savings, generated from operating a smaller fleet of combat aircraft, will be directed towards the acquisition of new aircraft systems, such as the next-generation air dominance fighter at the end of this decade, and the new MRX multi-role fighter in the 2030s. Sounds great. New aircraft will replace the old ones. Except, it was all just words, nothing more. Because next-generation air dominance doesn't exist in nature yet, and a certain decision point for the launch of the MRX program is now expected in 6 to 8 years. That is, the reduction in the active fleet of the U.S. Air Force is quite real. As for the replacement of retired equipment, it is not even visible on the horizon. And it is imperative to reduce the U.S. Air Force, because the situation is very bad. Obsolete aircraft systems are becoming significantly more expensive to maintain, and the U.S. Air Force operates one of the oldest combat aircraft fleets in the world. The average age of the U.S. Air Force combat aircraft fleet is 30 years. For comparison, the average age of the Royal Australian Air Force combat aircraft fleet is 9 years, and the average age of the British Royal Air Force combat aircraft fleet is 17 years. The U.S. Air Force is doing so badly that the service life of the fighters has been extended, the service life of which has long been exhausted. The American military is even forced to clean up aircraft dumps, not only in search of scarce spare parts for their aged aircraft but even to return to service already decommissioned flying coffins. Just the other day, the second dead man from the famous aircraft cemetery in the state of Arizona, B-52, was returned to the combat formation of the U.S. Strategic Aviation. Meanwhile, American effective managers, who know little about real war, continue to work on further optimization of the U.S. Air Force. It even got to the point that they decided to optimize close air support attack aircraft of the battlefield, A-10 Thunderbolt II. American effective managers claim that the A-10 close air support attack aircraft are not viable in the long term. It has insufficient survivability in the changing environment of global threats, and its limited set of capabilities make it ineffective in the necessary role of the available potential. The A-10 cannot perform the tasks of defending air against enemy aircraft, suppressing enemy air defenses, or providing a defense of U.S. territory. My friends, to be honest, I was surprised by such statements. The fact that A-10 Thunderbolt II is the only close air support attack aircraft of the U.S. Air Force, and it is absolutely not obliged to be an interceptor fighter or to provide defense of the U.S. territory, it seems, no one cares anymore. By the way, inviting such so-called effective managers to resolve issues is a common practice in cases where everything is going so badly that you need to break everything and call it radical reform, or deep reorganization. And all because there is no money. And the notorious $715 billion of the Pentagon, in addition to what I told you in this video, is also mercilessly eaten up by inflation, monstrous overhead costs, and, of course, elementary theft.